Hello everyone, and welcome to session 4 of our 7-part BizFlow Enablement series. To recap, up till now we've been in app dev where we created our performance evaluation form. We'll be revisiting the form in a later session to add additional UI and data logic to make the form even more intuitive for our end users. However, in this session, we're going to be in our BizFlow Process Studio, known as BPS, where we'll be creating the underlying workflow called process definition, which is what will be driving the form from role to role, defining who and how they'll be interacting with this form. With that, here is the overall layout and navigation of BPS. As you can see, we have our main toolbar across the top. On the left, we have our project list, and on the center right, we have our process definition or workflow window. And here is a closer look at specifically the process definition window, which is where we'll be spending most of our time for this session. And while we're on this slide, and before we navigate to BPS, let's take a quick look at our process. We'll go over the activities and the icons in more detail when we're actually in the product, but just from scanning the process, we can see that we have two main types of roles. We have the employee swim lane, and we have the reviewers swim lane, of which we have two reviewers, the employees manager and HR. The process starts from the left with the employee submitting their performance evaluation form, and then progresses to the two reviewers for their approval and comments before the process completes. Now that we have a basic understanding of our end-to-end process, let's go over to BPS. In BPS, the very first thing we need to do before we can start creating our process definition is to set up our working environment, and this means connecting to our server and creating our BPS project. Now, we only need to do this when it's our very first time working in BPS or when we have a new environment. So to do so, we're going to navigate to the main toolbar and click on the server icon. Doing so opens up the new BizFlow server modal, and here we can enter our server information. Once we've added our server to the list on the left, we can log in by right-clicking the server name, clicking Connect, and entering our login information. Now that we're connected, let's create our BPS project underneath our server. We can do so by right-clicking on the server name again, but this time clicking New Project. And that'll bring up the New Project modal, but for the purposes of this session, we already have our project, so let's go ahead and use that one. So finally, now that we have our working environment set up, we can create our very first process definition. Let's expand on our project name by clicking on this triangle to the left, right-clicking Process Definitions, and clicking New Process Definition. And that'll bring up our process definition window here. And actually, I'm going to minimize this section to the bottom. Now, the very last thing we need to do before we actually start creating our workflow on our canvas is to add this process definition to the server. This ensures that all of our work and our changes are being saved to the server rather than just locally when we check in our work. To do so, we're going to click the Add to Server icon here in the Process Definition window toolbar. We're going to give our process definition a name, so let's call this Performance Evaluation. I'm going to skip description for now, it's optional. And here I want to point out that the status is automatically in the editing status, meaning that it's being worked on right now and it's not ready to be published. So we're going to hit OK. And we can check that our process definition has properly been added by expanding on the process definitions folder, and here we see our newly added performance evaluation process definition. Now, the first thing we're going to do when creating our workflow is to check out our process definition via this icon here. And this does the same thing as in our app dev data modeler, where it lets our teammates know that we're currently working on it and it locks the process definition to our account. Let's also zoom into our canvas using these icons here. From here, everyone can have a slightly different approach when it comes to how they want to start creating and designing their workflows. In this case, let's start by renaming the pool to better define the process and to add some styling to make it stand out. To do that, we're going to right-click, select General, and let's give it a more descriptive name here, Performance Evaluation. To add styling, we're going to stay in the same modal, select the Style tab here. Let's give it a bright blue color and we'll bold it. All right, and we're just going to hit OK to apply. Next, we're going to adjust the number and the names of the swim lanes based on the number of roles we have in our process. To do so, we're going to right-click, select Swim Lanes, and if you recall from previously, we actually have 2 swim lanes, so I'm going to delete the third since we don't need that. And the first swim lane, I'm just going to double-click into the title column here for that first one, and that's going to be our employee column. And the second is going to be our reviewers column. Click OK to apply. To finish setting up our canvas, I'm first going to minimize our project list here to give us more room. And I'm also going to resize our canvas to make sure we have enough room for our activities. So I'm first going to select the employee swim lane. I'm going to hold Shift and drag that down. I'm also going to add more width by dragging the edges here. And I'm going to do the same thing for our reviewers swim lane. All right, now that our canvas is set up properly, we need to start dragging over the steps of our process, which are over here on the left under the palette window. So let's walk through the major and most often used types as we build out our process. First, every workflow must start with the start icon, and this defines where our process begins. Next, if you recall our process diagram from the beginning of the session, the first real activity that happens in the process is that the employee initiates their performance evaluation form. So since a real user is interacting with the application and process, we'll use the user activity. I'm also going to drag and drop that onto the canvas. We need to give the activity a meaningful name, which will also act as its ID in the system. So for this one, let's double click into activity 1 and we'll call it Initiate Evaluation. Next, as soon as the employee initiates and submits their evaluation, we know it needs to go to both their manager and the HR specialists for their review. So those are 2 more user activities, and these will drop under the reviewers swim lane since these are our reviewers activities. And the first we'll name Manager Review, and the second we'll name HR Review. Now we want both the manager and HR to have a chance to review the evaluation and add their comments before the process completes. It's not whoever gets to it first is the only one that gets to review it. So to ensure that the process waits until a specific condition is met, in this case that both the manager and HR specialist can do their review, we use what we call a gateway. And we have 3 major or common types of gateways: the and, the or, and the XOR, or the exclusive. So let's quickly review at a high level how each one differs from the other. First, we have our and gateway, And this is what we call an all-in, all-out, meaning that this gateway will wait for all incoming paths to converge, and then it will proceed with all outgoing paths. No additional business logic can be applied. So in this example that we have here, this AND gateway will wait for both activities 1 and 2 to be completed before it'll trigger activities 3 and 4, both outgoing activities. The next is the OR gateway, and this is the all-in, sum-out, meaning that this will wait for all incoming paths to converge, like the AND gateway, but instead of triggering all outgoing paths, it'll take one or more based on the conditions or business logic met. So in this example, as you can see, the OR gateway, just like the AND gateway, will wait for activities 5 and activity 6 to be completed. But based on the outcome of these two activities, it'll take either this first outgoing path to trigger activity 7 or the second to trigger activity 8. So if the outcome for activity 5 is approved and activity 6 is disapproved, then as you can see from this description here, the OR gateway will trigger activity 7. And then same thing if it was vice versa, if activity 5 was disapproved and activity 6 was approved. If both activities' outcomes are disapproved, then the OR gateway will trigger activity 8 following this second outgoing path. Third, and lastly, we have our exclusive or XOR gateway, and this is a one in, one out, meaning this gateway will wait for the first incoming path, and based on that first incoming path, it'll trigger one outgoing path based on the conditions that are met. So in this example, either activity 9 or activity 10 will trigger this gateway simply depending on which activity is completed first. Let's take the first example. So activity 9 is the one that's completed first and it's approved. Then as you can see here, the gateway will simply trigger this first outgoing path, activity 11. If activity 10 is completed first and the outcome is approved, then the gateway will trigger the second outgoing path and activate activity 12. Any other outcomes, for example, activity 9 is completed first and it's an outcome of disapproved, or activity 10 is the first one to be completed and it's disapproved, then the gateway will trigger the third default pathway and activate activity 13. So now that we know our gateways, let's go back over to BPS. Since we're not applying any additional business logic, we simply want the gateway to wait until both reviewers are done. So we need the AND gateway, which is, again, the all-in, all-out, where it simply waits for both activities to be completed. So from our list on the left here, we're going to look for our AND gateway, drag it onto the canvas. And then the last thing we need to do, just as every process needs to start with a start icon, we need to end it with an end icon. And we have a couple that we can choose from, but we're going to use the standard. We don't need the process to trigger a message once it's completed. We don't need to link it to another process. We don't need to give it a special status of terminate. So we're going to cap our process with the none end. And so now that we have all of our activities on the canvas, we've essentially mapped out all of the steps. We simply need to connect our activities based on how the process will flow. So starting from the start activity, we'll link it to the first employee activity, and we'll walk through how to kind of clean up our connectors here in a bit. Upon the employee submitting the evaluation, we're going to send the form to both manager and HR. And then from here, to make sure that the process will wait until both reviewers are done, we're going to filter both through the AND gateway. And then we're simply going to connect the gateway to the end. So to make sure all of these are in line, because we don't like those crooked connectors, I'm simply going to select all of the start, the initiate, the gateway, and the end. I'm going to use this middle align icon here in the toolbar to snap them into place. Now, if you look closely, you'll notice that there are question mark alerts on all of the user activities. This is because we need to identify a participant for each, essentially, who will be doing this activity. The first is simple. Since this is a corporate organization-wide performance self-evaluation, every employee in the organization should be able to initiate. So to assign the participant, we're going to right-click on the activity, click Participant, and here the participant type has already been auto-selected as initiator, so we're simply going to apply that to the activity. And click OK. And as you can see, the question mark icon or the question mark alert disappears. Moving on, the manager and HR review activities are slightly different. Upon submission from the initiator/employee, only those who are managers and HR specialists should be able to review the form. So for these, we've already gone ahead and created manager and HR specific user groups in our BizFlow admin module. So since these groups and their respective users have already been defined, we just need to select the user group and add it, not the initiator, as the participant. To do so, again, we're going to right-click, select participant. In the type drop-down, we're going to change it to user group, change the hierarchy to the one that's been defined for this performance evaluation process, click Modify to select the actual user group. And here, since I selected and clicked into the manager review activity, which I can see here by the modal header, I'm going to select our manager's user group. Click OK. Again, assign it to the activity by clicking this right arrow and click OK. And we're going to do the same thing for HR review. Except this time selecting HR specialists. So now that we've added all of the activities, we've connected them, and assigned participants to each activity, we are done modeling our process. Before we check in our changes, we're going to do one last thing. In the next session, we'll be mapping our form to our process, which will allow us to test the performance evaluation form as an end user. And when we do, the form will be displayed in a window/container called the Work Item Handler, abbreviated as WIH. The Work Item Handler provides some out-of-the-box toolbar capabilities, such as the ability to add attachments, comments, and send correspondence, and we'll delve into these more in our next session. In addition to these, it also provides buttons, such as Save and Complete, for users to be able to interact with the form and workflow. But we already have buttons built directly on to the app dev form, so we don't need the Work Item Handler ones. So to hide them, we're going to use a keyword that controls the Work Item Handler. So we're going to right-click on the canvas and click Process Variable. This opens up the Process Property modal, and here on the Process Variable tab, we can add, delete, and modify any variables for our process. Now, we're not going to delve into the variables much for the Enablement series, as these are intended more for our technical training, but just as an example, let's say we wanted to add a third reviewer in addition to the two we have now, the Employees Manager and HR. And for that third reviewer, let's say we wanted to route the process to them and the form to them if any one of our current two recommends the employee for a promotion. In that case, based on our earlier gateways and gateway logic discussion, we would be using the OR gateway rather than the AND. We would define a process variable called, for example, promotion recommendation, map the process variable to the recommended for promotion data entities in our universal data modeler, and this is so that the option selected on the form populates the process variable. And then finally, add business logic to the gateway to route the process based on the process variable's value, either directly to the end as we have now, or to the new third reviewer activity. So that's just one example of how we can use process variables, but again, this time we're not trying to define a new variable so much as just use a keyword to control what parts of the work item handler shows and hides. So here in our process variable tab, we'll select process instance, click add, and for the name, the keyword is WIH mode. And for the value, I'm going to paste the string I've copied, and it's no context, no app tab, and no toolbar. To apply, I'm going to click OK. For reference, here's a list of all the possible WIH mode values mapped to the individual sections/functionalities of the work item handler they control. We'll go over the work item handler functionalities in more detail in our next session, but here we can see that based on the values we've selected, we're hiding the application tabs, the toolbar, and the context area, which displays the activity name, the process definition name, and the created date. So now we're really done modeling our process. So lastly, we're going to check in our process definition to make sure our changes are being saved in the server. And no, we're not going to check it out again. So that takes us through the end of session 4. As always, let's recap what we covered in this session and then review in advance for our next session. In this session, session 4, we created our performance evaluation process definition in BPS. In the next session, session 5, we'll walk through how to actually connect the form to our process and test it out as an end user. With that, thank you so much for joining us for this session, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.